Well, welcome to UAF Summer Sessions Wednesday night Discover Alaska series. On behalf of the UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, I'd like to welcome those of you here in the room, as well as those watching via live stream. This is the Discover Alaska lecture. My name is Gretchen Murphy, and I belong to Delta Kappa Gamma, which is a professional organization for educators. I'm a retired teacher. Members of our organization will be introducing the Discover Alaska speakers each week. At UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Claudia campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Nome people of the lower Tanana River. This year's Discover Alaska lectures are presented by the UAF College of Indigenous Studies faculty members. Tonight we have a special treat. Claudia is from Nome. She is an associate professor of biology at the Northwest Campus in Nome. She's a biologist, which we'll hear fantastic things about her experiences with muskox. But also I want to point out, she's wearing a t-shirt and she painted, that's a pastel painting of hers. So she's a multi-talented person. She grew up in Germany and first came to Alaska when she rode her bicycle, I was impressed, from San Francisco to Fairbanks. She received both her master's and her PhD in biology from here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She lived and worked out at what we always called Muskox Farm, which is now Lars, or the large Robert G. White Large Animal Research Station. And out there she cared for muskoxen, caribou, and reindeer. She continues her studies on muskoxen in Nome, as well as on invasive earthworms, and doing her artwork, which I hope you talk about all of that. Very fascinating life out there. She does big, bad bug sculptures. So, got lots to learn from this fascinating lady. Please welcome Claudia Isle.
All right, before I get started, I want to make sure, how's the mic situation? Can everybody hear me? Okay, well, let's get going. So maybe I'll just raise my hand when I want the next slide. Will that work? Okay, let's do it.
Do it over your slideshow now?
Huh? Yeah.
Do it over your slideshow now?
Yes, Okie doke. So it's about muskox, and you probably guessed that already. And I'll give you a little introduction to what muskoxen are in general, what their story is in Alaska, and then I'll go into some of the research I've done over the years and the project I'm working on right now of our so-called urban muskoxen, because they have had, they've been coming into town for quite a few years now. So let's first, this is me, circa 1994. When I arrived in town on my bicycle, at the time I had no money and no sense, but probably lots of energy. And I pitched a tent somewhere on the UAF ski trails, and I tried to get into graduate school, so I knocked on a lot of doors. And one of the first people who took note was Bob White of the Robert G. White Large Animal Research Station, who became one of my first mentors. And one day I walked into his office, and then he said, "Well, where do you live?" And I said, "Oh, I'm my tent, I'm out on the ski trail somewhere." And he said, "Do you have any money?" And I said, "Oh yeah, about $51 or whatever I had." And he said, "What are you going to do when it gets cold?" And I said, "I guess I'll figure something out." So he set me up at the Muskox farm, and where I stayed for about 3 years or so while I was trying to get into grad school. And basically earned my keep by taking care of the animals. So this is, so Bob White, and I should also mention Bill Hauer, who was the manager of the Muskox farm at the time. So those two were my first mentors. And without that early support, I don't think I would have made the cut. Probably would have had gotten on my bike and paddled back south again. But this is Ingrid, one Muskoxen I bottle raised, and she's about 2 years old in that picture. All right. So first thing we need to clear up, what is a muskox anyway? The bad news is a muskox is not really a musk ox, because it's not an ox. I'll explain a little more what it is really in a moment. And it doesn't have musk glands really. The substance musk, which is used in perfumes, etc., comes from a different animal. The Latin name ovibos means sheep cow, literally, and that kind of is a little bit maybe closer to the truth. So to see where they really belong, Muskoxen are part of a large group of hoofed mammals called artiodactyls, and those are the so-called even-toed ungulates, meaning an ungulate, by the way, is a hoofed mammal. Oh, by the way, there's another good story. When I wrote my first, my master's thesis, at the time the spell check was a new thing and not very smart yet. And a day before I submitted the whole thing, I noticed that the spell check had turned all the ungulates into omelettes. So I had to go through my entire thesis and turn every omelette back into an ungulate. So, anyway, even-toed omelettes. And so these are hoofed mammals that have either 4 or 2 toes on their hooves. So it's a large group of animals. Anything from giraffes to hippos is in there. But the bovids is the biggest group. And the bovids contain oxen, cattle, which includes things like buffalo or yak or bison, gazelles, antelopes, and also the goats and sheep. And that's where you'll find the muskox. So a muskox is part of the goat and sheep subgroup of the bovids. So their closest relatives within North America would be things like mountain goats or bighorn sheep. And if that is hard to fathom, you might have heard that they like to butt heads. That's very much a goat thing. All right. So how many are there and where do they live? This is an Arctic ungulate, meaning they like to live in the very far north. And in fact, they go further north than any other large-bodied animal, really. This is a circumpolar map, so the North Pole is right in the middle. And if you look at these hatched areas here, that's northern Canada, the northern the northern edge of Greenland, northern and eastern Greenland. And those are places where where muskoxen have persisted since the Ice Age and have not died out. The black dots are places where at some point they may have been but had died out or were hunted out by people and were later reintroduced, and that includes the Alaskan populations. Worldwide, according to a recent estimate published by Christine Kyler and others, is about 168,000. Now that's not a very large number for an entire species. So this is not a common animal on planet Earth. So in many ways we're lucky that we can observe them right here in Alaska. So here's a little bit of an Ice Age picture. During the Ice Age it was much more crowded in Alaska. There were many large-bodied animals, including bison, horses, mammoths, and others. And there were other species of muskoxen too. And this guy here is probably a helmeted muskox, which is a species that lived back then. Some of those earlier species may have been around as long as 1.8 or so million years. And the current species, I think the information is a little unclear, but the oldest estimates I've found somewhere around 200,000 years ago. But that's as early as they may have been in Alaska. That is a cave painting down there from Chauvet in France, about 30,000 years old, of what appears to be a muskox. Sometimes they're called these Ice Age relics. That's a sort of a sticker that they got landed with, and that always comes up, Muskox, the Ice Age relic. And I guess I don't really like that because, well, yes, sure, they were here during the Ice Age, and they're still here now. But that's true of other species too. That's true of, ground squirrels, humans, wolves, many other things. So they're not unique in the sense that they have persisted since the Ice Age. although they're one of relatively few large ungulates that are still around. All right, let's have another picture. Here's the story in Alaska. So the original Alaskan population died out, the last ones at least, died out somewhere in the 1800s, maybe around 1860, in far northwestern Alaska. But we have them back because there was a reintroduction program that started in the 1930s when 30 young animals were caught in Greenland, in East Greenland, and brought all the way to Fairbanks. At the time this was called College, so they were kept here, and I guess until they were about 2 maybe. Then they were shipped out to Nunivak Island in the Bering Sea and released there. And once that population was multiplying, they released animals from there into other parts of western and northern Alaska, sort of reseeding the former range of Muskoxen. So today we may have about 4,000 of them in Alaska, give or take. And all of them come from those original 30s. So the genetic diversity in general is very low of this species, but so they're all more or less each other's grandpas, really. I think that's pretty... This is a bit of a complex picture, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea on what the year of the muskox looks like. Now, if you're an Arctic animal, the biggest challenge is really this enormous change of seasons, particularly of forage availability. Temperature is a challenge too, but less so than the availability of forage. So where are we now? We're now in the middle of the growing season, pretty much at the peak biomass. So this is right now, it's the all you can eat out there. So the job of any muskox during the summer is eat, put on some fat, grow if you're still growing, and get as fat and shiny as you can before fall. And then come fall time, you know, the kiviot starts growing here. They've shed their kiviot now from last year. The kiviot, by the way, is the warm underwall. They're going to start regrowing it here pretty soon. And then, the rutting season is coming up, always a lot of fun. And then the long winter, during which the biggest challenge really is access to food. So if we look at a muskox mom here, this by the way is Ingrid again and her firstborn kid, my grandchild, sort of. Mothers right now are nursing their calves from last year, but pretty soon they might get pregnant again if they're in good condition. So then they grow a new fetus and might give birth sometime in May. So that becomes a little relevant for the habitat data I will show later. You think about the plight of mothers when they come out of a winter and their body reserves are depleted, but they're already lactating because they gave birth at the very end of winter. And then they have to find new nutritious forage as fast as they can. So here's sort of the range in Alaska. I got this map off the website of Alaska Department of Fish and Game. You can see mostly northern and western Alaska. This is Nunivak Island, right here, where they were first released after being reintroduced to Alaska. For those of you who may not be from Alaska, maybe you all are, I don't know, but western Alaska is very remote. You can only get there by airplane, or by dog sled, I suppose, or snow machine. Nome has about 3,500 people, give or take, a few more in the summer, and a number of native villages around the area. That's what the area that our campus out there is serving. Most of our people, probably more than 50% really, are Alaska Native people. And if you think of the whole Bering Strait region, you know, we're the size of maybe West Virginia. We have maybe about 6,000 to 7,000 people. So it's a very remote area. This picture is from the first release of Muskoxen out there. The first one was in 1970, and then they released some more in the early 1980s. Those 30 young animals who had been brought from Greenland and had been raised to more or less adulthood, I suppose, here in Fairbanks. Out they go, out on the tundra. Clap on the back and good luck. So let's see how they did. Here's more data from Fish and Game, who have monitored population numbers over the years. And you can see here was the first introduction. Then there was another one here in the 1980s. And at first, starting a little slow here, but then, whoops, in mostly the 90s and early 2000s, the population really took off. At the time, they were colonizing new habitat, they were occupying the available space, There wasn't a whole lot of predation yet, maybe, more on that in a moment. Since like the early 2000s or mid-2000s, the population has somewhat leveled out and somewhat stabilized. So somewhere around 2,000 animals is what we have on the Seward Peninsula, which is about half of the Muskoxen in all of Alaska. This is a map again from Fish and Game. They have these game management units, which is part of their, administration deal. The one around Nome is this one here, which has about 400 Muskoxen in it. Most of those are probably hanging around in the vicinity of Nome. So give or take about 400, which is not a lot. But when they're all parked in your backyard, then it looks like a lot. So Muskoxen then, we don't know a whole lot about their history in Alaska. We know they were here still until the 1980s or so, but they were already rare at the time. There probably weren't many anymore. They may have been at very low numbers for a long time. But they were here at some point, so were people. So I think it's a pretty good guess that at some point people have hunted muskoxen in Alaska going back thousands of years. How long and exactly where is a little bit up in the open, I suppose. So there would have been traditions of hunting muskoxen that maybe got lost over the years because it's been outside of human memory that anybody had still hunted them. So there's not a lot of memory left in the population of native people do not have a long-term memory going back and hunting muskox. And so if that has happened centuries ago, it's no longer theirs. But now people are hunting them again, so hunting traditions are sort of being re-established. Here are some data from various places when hunts were initiated and when muskoxen were beginning to be hunted. On the Seward Peninsula, they were hunted since 1995. Some other places, well, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the population that is now mostly gone since 1989. And here, Nunivak Island, who got them the first in Alaska, they hunted them since 1975. So at some point, some years back, I did a little project going to Nunivak Island and comparing the hunting lore there with what people in our region on the Seward Peninsula knew, who at the time had not really hunted them that long. So this little project, we called it the Muskox Cultural Exchange. It was funded mainly by EPSCOR, so great thanks to those. And we sent a bunch of Northwestern hunters, that's us up there, to Mikoyak, where the local folks showed us how they deal with muskox. And Mikoyak is the only village on Nunivak Island. And one thing we all noticed immediately as we arrived there is that everybody's wearing kivyat. Kivyat hats, kivyat scarves, kivyat vests, kivyat everything. Everybody from the old guys to like little toddlers. So kivyat is very popular. And the women, when muskoxen get hunted, they comb the kivyat out of the fur using a comb or sometimes just a fork and spin it and knit it. And then we had a little cultural exchange workshop in Nome where we invited the Nunivakers to come up there to Nome and to show and bring some of their lore with them about muskox, processing of kivyat, hunting practices, carving of horns, etc. So that was a fun project. I also had interviewed people, it's a lot of writing on this, so I'll summarize it, where I compared knowledge and practices in Mikoyak to northwestern Alaska. And to summarize it, people in Mikoyak were much more established at using their muskox, and they hunted muskoxen a lot. They loved to hunt not just bulls, but particularly cows, which they say taste better. They were much more proficient at using the kivyat. Kivyat use was just taking off in northwestern Alaska. Many people didn't even know what to do with the hides, so they hadn't really fully, absorbed the idea of using the kivyat. So, in other words, these hunting traditions are coming back. People making new traditions now that they have muskoxen to hunt again. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. It will enrich people's culture and keep the animals around, I hope. So now to my current project. One of the issues we're having in Nome, which started maybe about 10, 12 years ago, is that the muskoxen are starting to wander into town. In Mikoyak, interestingly enough, they had this problem at the very beginning when muskoxen were first released there in the 1930s. On Nunivak Island, remember those were tame animals, they had been raised by people. So initially they hung around the village and caused a nuisance and knocked over structures and stuff. But as hunting was established, they became more shy and moved out into the backland of Nunivak Island. In Nome, it seems to have happened the other way around. They started out quite shy in the backcountry, but then at some point they decided, oh, let's go to town. Why do they do that? We don't really know. One thing that is clear is that urban wildlife is a growing issue worldwide. I mean, more and more you hear about these things. Here are just a few pictures from around the world. Anything from leopards in Bombay, I think, or it might be Bombay or Delhi or someplace. Wild boar running around in the cities of Europe. And you've heard of this guy, I'm sure. He was quite famous there. Moose who bought the Christmas lights and walked all over Anchorage. Yeah. So urban wildlife happens. Urban muskoxen are probably can we change the slide? Oh yeah, sorry. Urban muskoxen might be a problem somewhat unique to Nome at the moment. So this is some clippings from the Nome Nugget, our newspaper out there. So they hang out in the port, they hang out in people's backyards, and it causes a bunch of issues. So here are some of the problems we've seen, and some are worse than others. Lots of sled dogs have been attacked. Now, muskoxen do not respond well to dogs. And we have dog lots where dogs are tied up, and when a muskox wanders in or near the dog lot, sometimes they, panic, freak out, I don't know, the dogs bark, maybe the muskox doesn't understand that they're chained and can't run off, and they've been known to attack dogs. So a lot of dogs have been killed and many have been injured, so that is, of course, a very big problem to the local mushers. They've been blocking the traffic, both at the airport. The whole airport has a fence around it now because of the muskoxen. They've been hit by cars. I think that happened once or twice. That's not a very frequent thing. They headbutt structures. They keep people out of their berry patches because they're worried to get too close. And they kept the worst till last. We had one person who was killed by a muskox. As far as I know, the only fatality ever in Alaska. The circumstances, nobody knows exactly, but let's just say that that's him there, Curtis Warland. He's a very nice guy. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but he is a musher. He had his dogs, and the muskoxen were nearby, and he tried to drive them away from his trail, I think. Something that the mushers in Nome do all the time during the summer. This was in the winter, at a time when the snow was deep and crunchy and punchy. The muskoxen had been forced to come down from their winter ranges because of icing, and winter is a whole other ball game. More about that later. But something went wrong. All we know is that he got gored and ended up, I think, with a horn in his thigh, which severed his femoral artery, and that's about all I know about it. So that was very tragic, and I think it's important that we educate people around Nome, about how to be around muskoxen, and also find long-term solutions to keep them away from dog yards, to keep everybody safe. So there are some perks too to having muskoxen in town. It's very good viewing. This is not a common animal, and they live in very remote places. So this is one of the few places on Earth where you can fairly easily access wild muskoxen and photograph them in their wild habitats. So lots of wildlife fans come, lots of photographers. We've had quite a few film crews, and we have cruise ships that come to Nome now, and the one thing they all want to see is the muskoxen. So film crews, there have been quite a few. You might have heard of Frozen Planet. They've had 2 shows, Frozen Planet 1 and 2, and both of them have filmed muskoxen in Nome, and several other filming operations as well. So, all right. So how do muskoxen react to stress? You've all heard probably, let's click again, there, that they form this, something they're quite well known for, the sort of defensive circle. And muskoxen can run quite fast, but they don't run fast for very long. So when you can't outrun a predator, your best defense is to stand your ground, and they're very good at that. The upper picture is that's long ago, when we put radio collars on muskoxen. So they're surrounded, and they make a sort of huddle, or sometimes it's called a defensive circle, but it's not always a neat circle. It's like everybody goes, closest rank, and maybe the young ones are in the middle, maybe they're not. It's not always perfectly orchestrated. But for a predator, it's now difficult to go in there and grab one. If you're a wolf or a bear, it might be hard, right? But humans, I think, with guns and formerly with spears or arrows or lances, would have an easier time maybe of killing one. Because for one thing, they don't run away. In fact, one of my little pet hypotheses, for which I have absolutely no data, is that when Ice Age humans first moved across the Arctic, anytime they came into a new area, you'd have all these big animals there, you know, mammals, bison, horses, whatnot, and Muskoxen. Hunting those much larger, more formidable animals is probably harder and maybe riskier. Or for example, they know from examining bones of Neanderthals that they often had severe injuries, broken bones, broken ribs, whatnot, that may have happened while hunting big things like mammals. So if there's Muskoxen also, maybe that's the first thing you hunt because it's easy to get, they're relatively easy to kill because they don't run away, they don't move as much, they're pretty predictable as to where they are. So again, it's just a hypothesis I have in my head and I have no data for it, but I imagine that Muskoxen might have been among the first species targeted by humans when they moved across the Arctic, which might explain why they were ultimately only found in places where humans had no permanent presence, like the very far northern edge of Greenland and the Canadian archipelago. But in Nome, this behavior is often misunderstood, or at least used to. I think people are getting a little smarter about it now, but just because a muskox doesn't run away from you doesn't mean it's comfortable with your presence. So one thing is, again, you know, they often will not flee when you pressure them. They might even sit down when they're under stress, which seems counter-indicative. They look like maybe if they're sitting down, they must be relaxed, right? Maybe not, because they just don't feel comfortable getting up, spreading out and foraging when they think something's going on. They'd rather be close together and keep an eye on you. And if something happened, they can jump up and make their defensive circle. Okay. So that's the problem with our Nome muskoxen, though, that because they're so accustomed to human presence now, they become quite tame. Meaning they don't react the way that a wild muskox out in the field reacts anymore. It's suddenly too easy to get too close to them. And of course these people are minding their own business in their own houses, right? And the muskox is the one that's coming close. But we've also seen tourists try to go much too close to a muskox and photograph it. You've seen the equivalent, you know, YouTube videos from Yellowstone when people get pitched by a bison because they think, oh, it's just standing there, it's not. But the problem is, when they become too accustomed to people, it's easy to get too close before you hit the point at which the animal reacts, and then when it reacts, you're in reach of the horns. A truly wild muskox will react at a distance and either run away or give you some kind of warning sign, and it's unlikely you'll come to blows. So that is one thing that concerns me about you know, people interacting with muskoxen in Nome, particularly kids. That little Stepke up there, little guy. Well, he, hopefully he knows not to come down the stairs and to stay out of reach of that muskox. All right, so why did they come to town? Here's a few hypotheses. Maybe they came to town because there's less predation there. Maybe they don't get nailed by bears as much, bears being their major predators around Nome. Or maybe it is a habitat thing. And maybe it has to do with the vegetation appearing earlier in the spring. In my study, I'm focusing mainly on these last 2 points here. The first one was investigated by Fish and Game. They've had a study during the last several years on bear predation. Now these photos are some that I took. This was a herd that was a little ways outside of Nome, and I was working with a film team. We'd been there the night before filming the muskoxen, and then I came back early the next morning to find the herd so I could let the film people know where they were. And this is what I found. So after we had left, a bear had come there and had killed all the calves in the herd. Not eaten them, just killed them. One bite to the neck or something, that's it. So the Fish and Game has had a study for 6 years collaring newborn calves. And in summary, they found that about 58% or so of them get killed by bears in their first year. So that is the main cause of mortality. And why they only kill them and not eat them, I don't really know. I mean, if anybody has an idea, let me know. It's a bit of a mystery to me. You'd think that they go to the trouble of killing, they would at least make a snack out of it, but often they just leave them just like this. Muskox herds can make pretty dramatic moves after such an attack. Like this herd, when I got there 12 hours after we filmed them on the tundra, they had broken in 2 parts and they were scattered miles in 2 directions. So one of them was still on its way walking to the coast. So who knows, maybe some predation events have first driven them into town. As far as I know, Fish and Game found no difference in how many calves get killed, whether they're way outside of town or whether they're near town. And we have bears coming and walking right through Nome. Just recently they killed one that was hanging out by the hospital, so that happens too. So here's a quick overview of my project. I've had a few sort of summer projects funded by URSA and BLAST over the years, where different students doing a few weeks of the summer research project, and then I have a small NSF grant. And mainly, I'm going to talk mainly about this part today. I'm still waiting on some data for this, so that's not quite done yet. But the idea is to assess their habitat in town and to see what they're actually doing while in town. I mean, predation or not, one thing a muskox needs to do all day long is eat. So they have to eat while they're in town. What are they eating? So we'll look at that, particularly to see whether all the activity in town, the mining, the roadsides, the trails, will somehow create habitat that the Muskoxen like, or that works for them. And also to look at whether the activity of town makes things green up a little faster in the spring. So those are the 2 things that I'll mainly focus on today. Later on, when I get all the data, I'll add this stuff here about the nutritional profile of the various plants that they eat in town versus outside town. So let's have a look. Nome has had a mining history for since the early 1900s. You know, the gold rush there was in 1902, 1901, somewhere around there. And the type of mining that is practiced is called placer mining. So people pretty much scrape up large areas of the tundra, make big pits where they dig up the dirt, run it through a chute, and get out little bits of gold. And in doing so, they leave behind quite a mess. But all this cleared ground will eventually revegetate. And that revegetation is of interest to the Muskoxen, because here are some of these areas later on. Here's one of those old pits. What grows in there now is mainly sedges and horsetails, particularly a type called water horsetail. More about that in a moment. Muskoxen love it. And then other areas are now basically grasslands. And sometimes the grass comes naturally, but sometimes the miners actually put out grass seeds to speed revegetation. And you don't really get grasslands on the tundra normally. It's more, real tundra vegetation is quite different in character. So these are all areas that are preferred forage areas for Muskoxen. And that's one of my students there, Michelle Adams up there, collecting poop. So we had one student's project was to simply observe Muskoxen from a car. And that's one thing about the Nome Muskoxen. They're right by the roadside. You can park your car and look out your window and see what they're doing. Don't go that close to a wild muskox. And I wouldn't go that close to any muskox without a car. But when you're sitting in a car, you're safe. And you can actually see, not just guess and not just devise from poop collections or from looking at the plants themselves, but see with your own eyes which plants they eat. And these are the plants, the types of forage plants that they primarily focus on in town. Mainly look at sedges and willow bushes, like this old bull on the right there, he's eating willow. Sedges and grasses. And equisedum is also called horsetail. Those are those horsetails growing in those bogs. And then fireweed, if there are fireweed, they don't always bloom very well. It depends on what kind of summer. But during the summer, when there's lots of blossoms in late July or so, they eat a lot of fireweed as well. So let's, the sedges, the grasses and sedges are sometimes summarized as graminoids, so grass-like plants. The sedges tend to be a little coarser than the grasses. And the horsetail or equisetum, those will be of interest in a moment here. Here's one of those bogs full of that equisetum, so in the middle where they all are, muskox, that's the horsetail. A little further out you have sedges, and then you have willows around the edge, so all of their favorite foods concentrated in one place. And that's another horsetail bog. Now it looks like we're out in the boondocks, but I'm promising you this is in the middle of Nome. The police station is right here, and the hospital is right on the other side. I should have put them in the picture so you'll believe me, because it looks like we're out in the... And this is right by the big highway going to the Nome school. So, horsetail. We have two young bulls up there standing chest deep in water horsetail. Water horsetail is a type that grows, well, in the water, so in wet places. Here in Fairbanks, out in the woods, we have different kinds of horsetail. That feathery type, the forest horsetail is very common here. And down there, this is an old river arm somewhere on the northern Seward Peninsula, where you have similar vegetation. So the fun part about this horsetail is that early in the summer, this is an analysis for the amount of protein it contains. Now remember, I said something about muskoxen coming out of the winter, being a little depleted after a long winter, and particularly the females needing that nutritional peak, particularly of protein, because they have to rebuild their body condition, and they have to produce milk for their calves, so they need protein. Where do you get protein when you're an herbivore? Well, you eat stuff like this, and particularly in early summer, here like late May, early June, the stuff can have over 20% protein in it. That's pretty significant. I mean, that's basically like eating a steak. A lean steak might have about 20% protein. So you can get your protein if you're an herbivore, but you need to know what to eat, when to eat it, and where to go to find it. So if in town we have a lot of this horsetail because of the old mining areas, well, that's an attractive place to go early in the summer. So here are some of those other mining areas with the grasslands. This is the airport before it had the fence, and right behind it is what we call the grassy hill, which is a hill with grass on it, where they have put out grass seed, and this is some of the grass seeds that they sow out to get grass cover. And it basically, this is a big mine there, the green picture, that's a big mine outside of Nome, right outside the city, that we call the Serengeti, because it's essentially a grassland, which is really something that you don't get on the tundra. And Muskoxen love those areas. They had to build a fence around the entire airport because they used to get parked on the runway, and they had to divert flights or get flight delays and stuff. So grass is very popular. So get ready for some lawnmowers if you have a lawn in Nome. So note that these pictures were taken in the fall, and note how everything is basically, well, this is more like summer, in late summer, maybe August, but the other two are probably September. Things are starting to get brown everywhere, but these lawns are still very green. So green means probably more nutritious forage. So they like to mow lawns. And that can be a problem for people. As you might imagine, say you want to go to work and you have like a sizable percentage of the world's muskoxen parked right there in your backyard. You're probably somewhat reluctant to leave your front door, so that could be an issue. Yeah. Now, this is a picture taken out of the jet as it takes off from Nome towards Anchorage. And the actual city is right underneath the plane right now, and this is a view north. So right underneath the plane would be the beach and the edge of the Bering Sea and the main city of Nome. But this is a little subdivision called ICU. But what you can see here is that there's a big brown patch where all that activity around Nome is, whereas most of the country is still white. So during the time of snow melt, the snow appears to melt sooner in the city. Cities create heat, that's not, a secret. It's like all those little roadways and trails. Each one of them is sort of a place where melting starts and spreads out from there. So things melt out sooner in the city. So if you're a muskox that's up there, and then there are hills up there on the top of the picture, where they spend the winter, and you're thinking we need to go and find some food now that things are melting. Well, it just might be that you come from there, right along these roadways and these melting corridors, and it takes you right into Nome. It's at the airport back there, I'm not sure what that is, but anyway, again, the city is right underneath us here. So that's what we see happening in the spring. You know, as soon as it melts, they appear in town. Also, these are roadways, for example. This is a roadway very close to Nome. And you can see that really green stuff is horsetail. This is a different kind of horsetail, one that grows on land, the common horsetail. It has the fertile stands, the sporangia come out first, and they're very popular with muskox, and just mow them down. And then it comes out really nice and green when really most of the land is still brown. So some of the earliest green up happens along these disturbed areas, such as roadways and trails. This is a ditch right near town. So there are areas in town. This is right next to the police station. Again, it looks like we're out in the boonies, but I'm literally standing in the parking lot of the police station with a cop right behind me wondering what I'm doing there. This is natural grass. They say they haven't sown out grass seed there, so the grass came naturally. But the Muskoxen, that summer at least, made these rounds where every 3 weeks they'd come through there and mow the whole thing down. So you get actually, when you mow grass, it comes back richer and thicker. So they create, it's almost like they create their own grazing lawns, and of course leave plenty of fertilizer too. So that is really lush, and you don't get that dense collection of rich forage anywhere else, really, not quite like that. So we looked at the green up of muskox areas, and the way we did that is we went to areas where in the past, at least sometime over the last few years, we knew muskoxen had been foraged. And we checked areas outside of town versus areas in town. So we looked at bog habitats, tundra habitats, or slopes, and we picked 2 sites out of town and 2 sites in town that were sort of equivalent for those habitats. And then also we added areas where we actually saw the muskoxen go that spring, where we actually, caught them in flagranti, so to speak, feeding in town. And we looked at the rate of green up of vegetation, how green was everything already, particularly for grasses and horsetails, and how far along were the willows in those places. So those are some of the data I can show you, and then we resampled those plots every 2 or 3 days. So first of all, the cover, the vegetation cover of these places. So the blue areas here are remote sites, not right in town. Those are mostly sort of fully established tundra areas. And in town, we have somewhat similar sites, but more in town. These are the orange ones, and the green ones are the ones we call the highly disturbed sites. By disturbed, we mean these were areas like that lawn next to the police station or the road ditches, where human activity had at some point cleared the vegetation and where that new growth had come in. And you can see that the big differences are really in the amount of, let's see, the horsetails are much more common in town. Graminoids are really common on those disturbed sites. And other, these are mostly things like ericaceous shrubs, like, cranberry, blueberry, mountain avens, also called dryas, and in other words, things that muskoxen really don't eat much. You have a lot more of them, or quite a lot more of them outside. So those green areas are going to be the ones that are going to be of interest here in a moment. So these little dots are all the dots from our different feeding sites over time. So once again, the blue are the remote sites, the orange are the ones in town, the green ones are the ones in town where the muskoxen actually hung out that spring. So this is the amount of percent cover that was already green. This is for all vegetation combined. And you see that, on the whole, the green sites are greener at a certain date than the other sites, particularly the ones outside of town. This picture shows the trend, and it's a little bit fuzzy, but again, this includes all of the vegetation, including things that muskoxen don't necessarily eat as much. But if we focus just on the actual things that they most like to eat in town, namely the graminoids and the horsetail, the picture becomes pretty clear. Look at some of this, again, is the police station up there. That little tussock there. Look how nicely they cropped it and all. And I don't know, pick a date, let's say, I don't know, around, let's say, you know, early June. We have things here, some of these things here, these green spots are already, you know, over 50% green, whereas outside of town, it's barely even started to green up. So it's still mostly brown out there. There's grass out there and there's horsetails out there, but not as much, and it's still brown. You go to town and everything's green, particularly on these nice lawns. So eventually these sites outside of town will catch up more or less, but they'll never get to that same amount of greenness because they're not all grass. You know, there's other plants mixed in that don't get as green, such as ericaceous shrubs and other things like that are not of interest very much to Muskoxen. So you can really get a mouthful of very dense and nutritious and green forage right in town. And when we look at the greening up of willows, we see a similar picture. These are just blue sites are outside of town, and orange, yellow sites are in town. These are the catkins of willows, and willow catkins are among the very first, you know, things that muskoxen want to eat in the spring, and many other animals too. Willow catkins, I should say, are what we call a pussy willow. Ironically, it's actually the male plant. They come out first before the female willows come out. But they're a nice little bite, probably contain a good amount of protein as well. So anyway, you can see that outside of town, like again, pick a certain date, like let's say we, I don't know, randomly here, beginning of June, or like here, like in, let's say in late May. The ones outside of town are generally up here, and by the time the ones in town, rather, by the time the ones outside of town catch up, you know, we're maybe a week later or so. So the difference is maybe a week. That might not sound like much, but if you spend the whole winter up there on the higher exposed winter ranges, and you're getting hungry and you want your food, you're not going to wait another week if the grocery store is already open in town. So that's the catkins, and this is ultimately the leaves, once the leaves come out. And again, we see a similar picture of how the ones in town are all above, so they're a little bit earlier than the ones outside of town. So leaves and willows appear and green up about. It varies a little from year to year, I bet, but that year it might have been about a week or so sooner in town. This is just a quick protein analysis of young willow leaves. So CP is crude protein. There's not a significant difference here, but younger willow leaves, which are, let's say, younger plants that are regrowth on recently disturbed sites, such as the ones we have in town, they tend to have larger leaves and less stem material. So they tend to be maybe a little bit juicier and have less tannins as well. Tannins are the bitter compounds in plants that make plants somewhat unpalatable for animals. So they might be just a little bit more delicious and a little bit more nutritious than the leaves from old established willow bushes that you have outside of these more disturbed areas. So here's a bit of a picture of some of those places. So willows occur both in and outside of town, but maybe the ones in town, it might be a bit more attractive. So, in conclusion, so what we find so far, looking just at the plants targeted and the green, that they like habitats that are rich in these graminoids, particularly grasses and horsetails, and also willow. And that the vegetation they like the most greens up a little bit earlier in town. And particularly the places where these plants are most abundant and green up the fastest are the ones that the muskoxen seem to target. And then these are mostly these disturbed areas, mine tailings, mining bogs, roadsides such as trail or ditches, trails and ditches. Now, other things we do I do a little bit of outreach. I like to go to schools, talk to the kids, make sure they know, what do we do, what do we not do when a muskox comes into our neighborhood. So go to all ages. That's a kindergarten class there. And I think it's important that kids know how to behave around muskox, and that they understand that the muskoxen look tame. But again, there is that problem that when they're too tame, you can go too close before they react. So I try to make that point. And in the future, I hope there'll be more funding. These days, we don't know about that, but we hope. I told you about that fatality we had in Nome, which was very tragic. And the key issue behind that was that at the time we had a winter where there had been a lot of rain on the snow. This is a new thing. This has not happened much in the past, but now we get rain every winter. We get rainstorms when it rains on top of the snow and then it freezes. So the snow has these rock-hard layers of ice in it, or even right on top of the vegetation. So for the animals, this means they can't get through there. Normally they dig craters, but they can't dig through that hard snow. So what do? They might have to change their behavior. And when the snow is like, this is like a normal winter range, for example. This is a high hilltop. The snow there is shallow. It gets blown away by the wind. Little bits of vegetation are sort of partially exposed. And then they push some more aside with their noses. The snow can be quite hard when it's wind blown, but it's usually not rock solid. But with these rain on snow events, the snow becomes rock hard, and it gets very, very difficult to dig a crater like this. These were Muskoxen who did this. But that's a huge energy expenditure, and then there's maybe not much in there, a couple of bites of food or whatever. So they started to come down from their high winter ranges. Usually they're up high on hilltops, more into the valleys, and that's what happened the day Curtis was killed. They had come down from those wintering ranges into low-lying areas where they normally wouldn't be that time of year. And they might even eat willows that stick out above the snow, like a moose would do, which is also not typical for Muskoxen. So they try to adjust as best they can, but whether or not this has consequences for them nutritionally, this is something I would like to investigate in the future, and how they adjust, how they change their habitat use in the winter, and how they cope with these changing snow conditions. So, lastly, my thanks here to a variety of students who've come and gone over the years. A lot of them have done sort of summer projects on this. And funding has come from URSA, from BLAST, and from the National Science Foundation. And, I mustn't forget Pop-Up. She is an expert at locating muskox fecal samples. Not always easy to find when they're in tall grass and stuff, but yep, she can do it. So, if you have any questions. This guy, by the way, when I did my master's out of Deering, there's an old mining town near Deering called Utica. And one day I was coming through there, it was raining, I was bored, and I found all this old junk. I made a muskox. Maybe it's still there. Okay, if you have questions, please ask away.
We have to use the mic so it picks up on the...
What percentage of their body weight can they lose over the winter time?
Quite a lot. So
Studies done on that?
Probably, especially on captive muskoxen. There might be some wild studies out there too, but I remember when I worked on the muskox farm, our big fat females, they might weigh 500 to 600 pounds in the fall. I know we had one big fat one called Vicky. She always weighed over 600 pounds. And then they could easily lose 100 pounds of that over the winter, and maybe more in the wild. I mean, remember, captive animals, after all, get fed, although they do voluntarily reduce their intake over the winter. It's part of being an Arctic animal that you reduce your food requirements, because, no point in being too hungry at a time when there isn't much food around. So yeah, they can lose a significant amount of that weight and then put it all on again during the summer. Yeah?
Has there been any problems because they all came from just a small pool of 30?
Good question. I'm not aware of that. I've always wondered all these years, is all that, are they really inbred? I mean, is that an issue? But I have not heard of any really significant findings that would have been a problem. And also, it's typical for the entire species, wherever they are, to have a very low genetic diversity. Probably because over their history, they've had a few so-called bottlenecks, where there maybe at least one, when they were hunted by people, where maybe a few animals were reduced to just or populations were reduced to a few animals, or a few animals maybe colonized a new Arctic island and then spread out. So this low genetic diversity is typical for the whole species. Genetic diversity is always puts the species in general at higher risk because it makes them less likely to be very adaptable to changes. But I don't know of any immediate effects of inbreeding.
Make her earn more keep.
Yeah.
Do you have other wildlife in that area besides bears?
Oh yeah, we got all of it really. We have, let's say, bears. Wolves are not common right around Nome. Occasionally one gets seen, but wolves are currently not a problem as predation on Muskoxen, not in Nome anyway.
Do you have moose in
We
that
have
area?
moose. We see moose. We have.
How do they get along, the moose and the Muskox?
I don't think there's much of an issue between moose and muskox, and they don't overlap an awful lot. The moose tend to be more lowland in the riparian areas. However, good question, because moose in the winter tend to also feed on willows that stick out above the snow, and I've seen muskoxen starting to do that when they can no longer dig through the snow. So whether in the future there's some kind of let's say spatial issues with moose and muskoxen. Maybe that can happen sometime in the future. I haven't observed it yet, really.
It would be a turf war.
A turf war, yeah, good. Or as we say, competition.
Yeah.
I actually, my early research on muskoxen was actually the question is, do they compete with reindeer or caribou? And that question pops up regularly around the Arctic, where muskoxen and caribou overlap. But I could not find that they do in my study, and most other studies haven't really found conclusive signs that they do. Also, one has to remember that once upon a time they shared their range not just with reindeer or caribou, but with a whole bunch of other big animals, horses, bison, camels, saiga, antelopes, mammoths, you name it, they all live together in the general landscape. So I think these animals are quite good at getting out of each other's way in general. So in my study, there was a little overlap in what they ate, but not that much, and they would occupy different places at different times. Any more questions?
Oh, here we go.
Yes, maybe I misunderstood, but you said that some hunting is allowed in Nome, in the area.
There's a what?
Some hunting,
Yes.
yes. And so what is the rules and regulation for the hunting? It's mainly from native people, or do they can kill only one muskox per year, or how it works?
Yeah, it's I must admit I'm not totally up to date on the Fish and Game rules and regulations about it. It's a subsistence hunt, so a certain amount of animals are being allowed to be hunted every year. That depends in part on the population counts, and then there's a sort of people can sign up for it. And so far, mostly it's been a hunt of bulls. At times, I know in McCoyak they also hunt cows, and they actually prefer to eat cows. They say they taste better. So yeah, there is a hunt, but it's fairly limited. It's not a lot of animals. Remember, we only have about 2,000 animals on the whole Seward Peninsula. And although when they're all in your backyard, it's easy to say that there's too many muskoxen. Really, 2,000 is not that many, and a single caribou herd can have more than that in just one bunch. So, yeah, hunting quotas are usually carefully set to make sure that population is not overhunted. So they take into account how many animals have been counted and also the recruitment, meaning how many of the calves survive. So how many new animals are being made every year and survive to adulthood, and that will determine how many can be hunted safely without putting too much of a dent in the population.
How many,
Wait. It's our friends online, you know.
Oh yeah.
I have two questions. On average, how many calves are born in the Nome area? And then my second question would be for the Muskoxen tribes or group of indigenous people that are eating muskox. Is there a certain part where they eat all of it? Is there a certain part that's a delicacy?
Oh, good question. So how many calves exactly? You know, I'm not sure. That varies probably from year to year. But if we assume that maybe the majority of healthy cows over the age of 2 can give birth, but remember, at least 60% or so of them will die, maybe more, maybe only 30% make it to adulthood. Once they survive their first year, their survival is pretty good, but it's like the first year particularly, maybe the first 6 months when the calves are really vulnerable. So, yeah. So I don't have the exact number in my head, but let's just say, you know, if you consider maybe that out of 100 cows, if maybe 80 are pregnant and give birth, and maybe of those 80 calves, maybe 20 or 30 survive. I mean, that would, or well, that's not what 60% out of 80, I don't know. Let's say maybe only a handful of those ultimately, you know, a relatively small amount will survive. And then what was the second question? Oh yeah, about which parts of the muskox. Yeah, I mean, the people in Muskox, they were very good about using the whole animal. They eat all the meat, they carve the horns, they use the kiviot. Which parts of the meat are most delicious? You know, I'm so not a cook. I don't know. What are the best parts of a cow? It's probably not so different on a muskox. Is it the rump? Do people like the rump? Like when I get scraps of meat from friends, etc., it's usually the leftover stuff, like from the legs, etc. So, yeah, I don't know for sure. But muskox tastes pretty good, you know, unless if you haven't shot a rotting bowl full of hormones, hopefully, then it can be very delicious, particularly as a roast.
So I was curious about the 60% of the calves, the first year calves you had with bear predation.
Yeah.
Do you have any figures on the bears killing moose calves?
You know, the Department of Fish and Game has probably data on that. I know they kill moose calves too, probably at a high rate as well. I imagine that bears are big you know, probably one of the main causes of mortality for moose calves. So yeah. Yeah.
They could save them, and then they get more when they were adults, stupid bears.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's a bit of a mystery why a bear would run through a herd of muskox and kill all the calves and just leave. I have no idea. I have a very faint, vague hypothesis in the back of my head, again, without any data whatsoever. But here's the thing about bears. Bears have a habit of killing bear cubs. When a bear, an adult male bear, you know, they routinely kill cubs of other bears. The idea being, mama gets pregnant again, and then you knock her up, and then the next set of cubs is yours, probably. I don't know. And there's something about newborn muskox calves that resembles bear cubs in size and color. Not that the bears don't know the difference, I'm sure they do. But I've sometimes wondered whether it just triggers something in them. But again, this is a crazy idea, and I have no data for it. It's just trying to make sense of something that doesn't seem to make sense. But bears are highly intelligent creatures, and with great intelligence comes a certain amount of, I don't know, mayhem sometimes. Maybe they just enjoy it. Maybe it's just a sport to them. I don't know. Not to diss bears, you know, I love bears, I love all wild animals, but it was kind of sad, I must admit. I was very sad finding all those cute little muskox calves just newly killed when we just had filmed them the night before, all playing and running around. So, yep.
do you sell your t-shirts?
Oh God, I'm afraid this is a sort of prototype which I made just to see if it will work out. So I have a website, so my art is on the website.
Okay.
And yeah.
So could you tell us your website?
Oh dear. Just my name, claudiail.com.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. And it's IHL.
IHL, right? It's German. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sorry.
Good.
Yeah,
No,
right.
That's good. Fascinating talk deserves fascinating questions.
So if one wanted to travel to Nome to see the muskox in the wild, what would you suggest would be the best time, besides all the time?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends a little bit on what you want to see. If you want to see calves, and like right now is a fun time. When the calves are a few weeks old, they're kind of cute, they get a little active, they run around, they play. So that's a fun time to watch. During the late summer, fall, the rutting season is fun to watch. You get to see some rutting activities. There's some bud sniffing, there's some courtship behavior, and maybe even some headbutting between the bulls if you're lucky. So during the fall time, you have the fall colors and lots of berry pickings, and there's other fun things you can do.
So the muskox with the calves will actually stay near town?
They often do, yeah. I mean, they're not always right in town. They come and go. So really what the herds do is they kind of circle around a little. They're in town and they go out of town. This spring, they've actually been in town a little less, and I wonder if weather has something to do with it. It's been very warm and dry, and when it's hot, they like to go up into the hills where the last remaining snowfields are, and they like to sit on or near those snowfields to cool off. So they have been up in the hills a little more, but the hills are still only a mile or so out of town, so if you go to Nome, rent a car, drive the roads a little, you should see them somewhere. Yeah, they're fairly hard to miss. I mean, it's like these, big old brown animals. Although not as big as people think, like when I worked on the Muskox farm all those years ago, I gave tours to the public, and people had been fed by these stories of the Arctic, giant Arctic muskox or whatever, and they come to LARS, the Large Animal Research Station, and they find that, no, not that big, like a big bull stands maybe this tall. And then in the summer, when they've lost all their kiviot, in particular when it's raining, and they will all look like these bedraggled little things with their hair coat all hanging down, and they didn't look that impressive. So people sometimes were like, I thought they were bigger. So I had a friend back then who would say, well, we should rename the place Medium Animal Research Station, or Mars, just to make sure people don't have, false expectations. But in the fall, they look very beautiful. Their kiviot is coming in, they're fat, right? They've eaten all summer. Their hair is nice and shiny, and that's when they look the most magnificent, I think. And of course, in the winter is a good time too, but in the winter you can't really drive far out of Nome. You probably need a snow machine if you want to go. And the Muskoxen are not going to be in town, unlikely at least. They're more likely are out on the hills surrounding the city. Yeah.
Any other questions? Good. Well, thank you for coming. This is the Wednesday night, and remember, every Wednesday night there will be a fascinating talk here. And let's give Claudia our appreciation.
Thanks, Paul.